Hello, everybody. My name is Stephanie Bonack. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach here at the National First Ladies Library in Canton, Ohio. Thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual legacy lecture featuring Leslie Goddard. Before we officially get started, I'm going to introduce our CEO and President, Patty Dowd-Schmitz, who'd like to say a few words before we start.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to be hosting Leslie Goddard. She is an amazing First Lady interpreter, and I think you're just going to be so thrilled by her presentation about Jackie Kennedy. Maybe if any of you would like to put in your chat where you're from today. We always love to see how many people are coming from all over the country to watch these webinars. And we're just thrilled to have you. If you would like to join any of our other programs that we have going on throughout the next few months and throughout the year, you can go to firstladies.org, and we have all of our programming listed there on our programs page. So I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie to introduce our featured speaker, Leslie Goddard. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Patty. So for those of you that do not know Leslie Goddard, she's fantastic. She is a Ph.D. holder and award-winning scholar and actress who has been portraying great women in history for more than 20 years. She holds an interdisciplinary Ph.D. from Northwestern University, as well as a master's degree and undergraduate degree in theater. A former museum director herself, she currently works full-time as an actress, public speaker, and author. Recognized as one of the top historical performers working today, her portrayals have been seen by audiences in more than 35 states, including scores of universities, museums, libraries, civic organizations, and Chautauqua festivals. So a bit more about our program today. We're going to set some historical context. For those of you that are just joining in, it is 1 year after her husband's assassination, and the former First Lady, besieged by tourists and paparazzi, is struggling to cope. As she attempts to determine her next step, she looks back on her life, sharing stories about her marriage, her fight for privacy amidst intense media scrutiny, her work to restore the White House, and her attempts to showcase the arts. Historian and actress Leslie Goddard portrays Jackie Kennedy in this unforgettable portrayal where you will meet the private woman behind the public myth. Take it away, Jackie.
Thank you. And I also would like to thank everyone so much for coming. And I'm so glad I haven't had to keep anyone waiting. It's so hard for me just to get around these days. The crowds outside my house, they are just impossible. Tourists everywhere. They eat lunch on my lawn and throw sandwich wrappers on the ground. And it's like this every day, busloads of tourists going by. Sometimes I can hear the guides on the loudspeakers saying, "This is the home of Jacqueline Kennedy, Caroline, and John." We have become a sort of, well, there ought to be a nicer word for it than freak show, but I don't know what it is. Really, I'm becoming tired of starring in everyone's vacation movies. Thus, you see, my dark glasses. Might be that all of them are looking at me, but none of them can ever tell who I am looking back at. At least that way I can have some fun with it. To be quite honest with all of you, I hardly know what to do next. Should I stay in Washington with no privacy and stared at constantly? I know that when my husband died, I always said I would stay in the places where Jack and I had lived, but now I'm really not so sure. I hardly know what to do next. Oh, but forgive me. All of you did not come here today to hear about my troubles. My topic today is not the incessant nuisance of the prying public, but rather my experiences as the wife of a U.S. senator and then president. But of course, for that, I hardly know where to begin. My experiences were not at all like those of most first ladies. Very few of them have come into the White House as the mother of 2 small children. Do you know I had to hire a press secretary? And I told her, my primary goal is to protect my privacy and my children's, but not to offend the press. I would like to have minimum information be given out with maximum politeness. Tell reporters I will be a wife and a mother first, and then First Lady. Oh, I really still hate that term, First Lady. It always sounds to me like some sort of saddle horse. But you know, Caroline was affected very young. Caroline spoke her very first words during the 1960 presidential primary. Would you like to know what they were? Goodbye, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, and West Virginia. I said to Jack, well, I'm sorry that so few states have primaries, or we would have had a daughter with the greatest vocabulary of any 2-year-old in the country. And when we got to the White House, I knew she would have to go to school. And if she were in the newspapers all the time, it would affect her little classmates. They might have treated her differently. So we set up a nursery school and then a kindergarten right in the White House. The children's parents, they paid all the expenses for the teachers and the supplies. I just wanted to provide as much of a sense of normalcy as I could. Normalcy, as if that were even possible in the White House. Do you know the First Lady I always had the most affinity for? Mrs. Harry Truman. Well, think about it. She brought a daughter to the White House at a most difficult age, but managed to keep her from getting spoiled. She kept her family together despite White House demands, and that is the hardest thing to do. That was the most wonderful part of it. In the White House, Jack was home every night. Sometimes we even had lunch with him. If you had told me that would happen in the White House, I never would have believed it. For myself, I always tried to work in the morning and save lunch and as much of the afternoon as I could for the children. If you bungle raising your children, don't think it matters very much what else you do. If Jack had been the greatest president of the century, but his children turned out badly, that would have been tragic. But of course, when you are married to a politician, you really can't not be involved in their political life. Even when Jack and I were dating back in 1952, Jack was spending most of his time in his race against Henry Cabot Lodge. So he was spending most of the weekends up in Massachusetts. He would call me up from some oyster bar with this great clinking of coins. And I'd find myself saying, Jack, darling, is that you? The movie's Wednesday? Yes, I'll be here in Washington. Will you? How he could switch so rapidly from political campaigning one minute to dating the next, I will never understand. But this was always one of Jack's great charms. He had this ability to focus and then just shift focus so rapidly. My life did change when I met Jack, but not for the reasons most people think. We met at a dinner party given by friends of ours who had been shamelessly matchmaking for nearly a year. Usually that sort of thing does not work out, but this time it did, so I am grateful. Jack was different, something special. I remember my mother used to bring around all these bows for me, but Jack was different. I was working at the time as a reporter. I was with the Washington Times Herald newspaper. I was their inquiring photography girl. It was not very demanding work, but it got me out. My job was to walk the streets of Washington and ask hard-hitting questions like, do you think the rich enjoy life more than the poor do? Or do you think that a wife should let her husband think he is smarter than she is? I even interviewed Jack. To him, I said, tell me, Congressman Kennedy, can you think of any reason why a contented bachelor would want to marry? Now, this whole job was mostly to defy my mother. She had refused me a chance to do an internship at Vogue magazine. It would have been 6 months in New York, 6 months in Paris. And I won the contest for that, but my mother had other plans for me. My mother she was always rather strict with us. My mother never hesitated to give us the back of her hand when she thought it necessary. That's my sister, Lee, and I. Yeah, Lee was always the pretty one. I guess I was supposed to be the smart one. If you see pictures of my family from when I was growing up, the gentleman you probably will see will not be my father. You'll see my stepfather, Hugh Auchincloss. My mother married him when I was 11, 2 years after my parents divorced. But I did see a good deal of my father, especially after I went away to boarding school at Miss Porter's. All my Farmington friends loved Daddy. Well, he was the most devastating figure, droopingly handsome. All my friends adored him, and they used to line up to be taken out to eat whenever he came to visit. He would take batches of us out to eat at the Elm Tree Inn and then sit there, drink in hand, while we all ordered steaks and 2 desserts each. We must have eaten him broke. To my mother, school was supposed to lead to marriage. All parties and dances, I attended my fair share, but Newport, where I spent most of my summers when I was growing up, when I was about 19, I did not know what I wanted in life, but I knew I did not want to marry any of the young men that I had grown up with, not because of them, but because of this lifestyle, handsome young scions of rich families. They bored me in about 5 minutes. I remember once talking to a young man I had just met, and I said to him, well, I'm amazed you have your whole life planned out that way. Let me see if I have this right. Career, marriage, house, dog, country club, children? Tell me, do you have your gravesite picked out yet? Me, the only thing that matters to me in a man is that he weigh more and have bigger feet than I do. Size 10, good heavens. To my mother, this was the height of carelessness. Jacqueline, she would say, your choice of a husband is the most important decision you will ever make. Be smart, Jacqueline. Better to be bored with a rich man than bored with a poor one. So you see, when Jack and I were dating, I was not at all sure I even wanted to marry. A cousin of mine asked once, was there any truth to the rumors that Jack and I were serious? And I remember saying to him, well, you know, Jack goes to a hairdresser almost every day to have his hair done. And if, when we're at a party or a reception or something, no one recognizes him and no photographers take his picture, he'll sulk about it afterwards for hours. Really? Oh, he's so vain, you can't believe it. And he's ambitious, all right. He even told me he plans, well, his father plans, he will be president of the United States one day. My family had mixed feelings about Jack and his family. The Kennedys are like carbonated water, and all other families are just flat. They would be talking about so many things with so much enthusiasm, of playing games at dinner or in the living room. Everywhere, everyone would be talking about something. They competed with each other in conversation to see who could say the most and talk the loudest. Just watching them wore me out. The one person in my family who adored Jack was my father. My father and Jack hit it off right away. I remember we three had dinner shortly before we were engaged. They spent the whole night talking about, what else? Politics, sports, and girls. It's what all red-blooded men like to talk about. And then one day, I remember calling out my aunt, Auntie Edie, I want you to know I've become engaged to Jack Kennedy. Yes, but you cannot tell anyone about it for a little while because it wouldn't be fair to the Saturday Evening Post. The Post, they're coming out tomorrow with a story about Jack on the cover. Jack Kennedy, the Senate's gay young bachelor. I know. I have taken the choicest bachelor in the Senate. Now, I, of course, was hoping for a small, elegant wedding, but the Kennedys would have none of that. We had 26 groomsmen and bridesmaids at our wedding, 900 guests at the mass, 1,200 at the reception. My mother was terrified of Jack because she couldn't push him around at all. I, of course, expected that my father would walk me down the aisle, but on the morning of the wedding, he started drinking, and my mother refused to even permit him to attend. My stepfather, who we called Uncle Hudie had to step in and walk me down the aisle. I would like to thank everyone so much for being here today and sharing today with us. Do you know, my mother always told me that I should wait and judge a man by the quality of his correspondence. Wish you were here. Cheers, Jack. This is my entire correspondence from Jack Kennedy. Living with Jack was like being married to a whirlwind. He was indestructible. People who tried to keep up with him dropped like flies, including me. I remember one morning, the very first year we were married, he said to me, What are you having for the 40 people who are coming for luncheon today? One had told me anything about it. It was 11 o'clock in the morning and they were expected at 1. I was in a panic. And Jack was traveling all over the country in those days, giving speeches. He was never home more than 2 nights in a row. I was alone almost every weekend. It was all wrong. Politics was sort of my enemy as far as our home life was concerned. And my other enemy, well, I went into our marriage with my eyes open. My sister-in-law, Joan, who was married to Jack's brother, Teddy, I think she had more illusions than I did. I remember saying to her once, Jonesy, Kennedy men are like that. You have to block it out. I say, imagine you are listening to a station on the radio and you turn the channel because you don't like what's playing. But we worked it out. We made concessions. Jack learned to enjoy fine cuisine more than just his favorite clam chowder and pigs in a blanket. I boned up in American history and I learned how to golf. Jack began to dress much more fastidiously. He even agreed to go to art galleries and ballets with me. I did sometimes help him in his work. I could translate for him a speech on Indochina when so much of the original material was in French. But my most important role, the best thing that I could do for him, was to be a distraction. A husband lives and breathes his work all day long. If he comes home to more table thumping, how could the poor man ever relax? So I never said anything or did anything upsetting. And when he came home, I always liked to have his favorite record playing and perhaps a few friends. Oh, and his favorite drink. I must share with you this. This is Jack Kennedy's favorite daiquiri recipe. I had to tape this up in the kitchen of the White House so the staff would get it right. You mix together 2 parts rum, 2 parts frozen limeade, add 1 part fresh lime juice, and a few drops of falernum. The fresh lime juice, now that's key. I would have so much preferred to remain like that, behind the scenes, not out in front, where you're always being stared at and analyzed. Everything you do, what you wear, what you say. I am so grateful to my parents for the efforts that they made to teach us foreign languages. The people we met campaigning who contributed so much to our country's culture. It always seemed to me only a proper courtesy to address them in their own tongue. Queridos amigos, les hablan la esposa del senador John F. Kennedy, candidato a la presidencia de los Estados Unidos. Para el futuro de nuestros niños, votan ustedes para el Partido Democrática. So much of politics is unfair. It always seemed to me so unfair of people to be against Jack merely because he was a Catholic. He was such a poor Catholic. If it had been his brother Bobby, I might have understood it more. And all those letters saying I should change my hairstyle to something more fitting for the wife of a presidential candidate. Jack used to come in the morning and say to my secretary, "Oh, Mary, how's the mail coming on Jackie's hair? Amusing, perhaps, but also puzzling. What does my hairdo have to do with my husband's ability to be president? I will admit I did bar photographers from taking any photographs of me smoking. Jack was such a bear about my cigarettes. It's a bad habit that I picked up at boarding school. I was always trying to imitate those girls who had callers every Saturday night. I passed the finish line up in the balcony of the Normandy Theater in New York by a girl who pressed a cigarette on me and then led me out when an usher came to say, "People cannot hear the film with all that coughing going on." So no photographs smoking. And then Women's Wear Daily reported that Jack's mother and I each spent $30,000 a year on French clothing. That's just dreadfully unfair. I couldn't spend that much, I told them, unless I wore sable underwear. I'm sure I spent less than Mrs. Nixon did on clothing. But when Jack complained, I said to him, "Well, I have to dress well, Jack, so I don't embarrass you. As a public figure, you would be humiliated if your wife were photographed in some saggy old house dress. Everyone would say your wife is a slob and refuse to vote for you." Of course, for most of that campaign, I knew I was expecting another baby, and I could not play much part. I thought I should be with Jack, and if it hadn't been for the baby, I would have campaigned vigorously. Can't be so presumptuous as to think I would have had any impact on the outcome, but oh, it would have been tragic if Jack had lost by a few votes merely because I was not at his side. And what if people had met Mrs. Nixon and liked her? Of course, at least it got me out of those dreadful chicken dinners. Oh, you know, sitting up at a head table where you couldn't have a cigarette, having to wear those silly corsages and listen to some old windbag drove me up the wall. Poor Jack. But all his hard work paid off in November. His deepest wish, well, his father's deepest wish come true. The 35th president of the United States. I heard Jack's inaugural address in little bits and pieces many times when he was working on it at the Kennedy winter home down in Palm Beach. But when I heard it that day in Washington as a whole for the first time, it was so pure and beautiful and soaring. I knew I was hearing something great. I knew it would go down in history as one of the greatest speeches ever given. Do you remember? Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. There was so much I wanted to say to him, but I could hardly have embraced him in front of all those people. So when we were alone, I just said to him, "Jack, you were wonderful." His family was walking on air, but to me, it was really terrifying. It's really frightening to lose all your anonymity at age 31. We had to begin giving parties, and we had our very first reception just 9 days after the inauguration. Of course, I think the people who came through were really surprised because we had set up a bar in the state dining room. There had been minimal alcohol before. We had bartenders there to stir up martinis and have scotch and champagne. And we put ashtrays all around so people could smoke if they wanted to. Before, there had only been ashtrays hidden in tables in case of an emergency. And for the state dinners, we took out those dreadful, long, formal tables set up in an E shape. We put in round tables because I wanted people to be able to really talk to each other. And we traveled a great deal, Jack and I. Fortunately, Jack never required much more from me than perhaps to give a short speech or two. I know we share the desire of bringing to all the people of this hemisphere a better life for themselves and their children. I never envied Jack the difficult tasks. In Vienna, such a difficult summit. Jack always compared the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, to his father, always expecting all give, no take. There was very little I could do, except perhaps I could help the Khrushchevs feel a bit more comfortable. One afternoon at tea, I remember the crowds outside the window started calling out, "Jackie, Jackie." So I asked Mrs. Khrushchev to come to the window with me, and we waved to the crowds together, and soon they were calling out, "Jackie, Nina, Jackie, Nina." It's a small contribution to international diplomacy, perhaps, but something I could do. When I visited India and Pakistan, it was without Jack. I had no desire to be a public figure on my own. And the international press, I know, criticized me on that trip for wearing high fashion on a country so overrun with poverty. I finally had to tell my press attaché, do not release any more fashion information. I know I am more of fashion interest than other first ladies, but really, I don't want to be plagued by any more fashion stories of a sensational nature. I don't want to be the Marie Antoinette of the 1960s. I'm glad I went, but I vowed never to do another trip like that. Jack was always so proud of me when I did something like that, but really, I cannot stand being out in front. I know this will sound trite, but what I really wanted was to be behind Jack and to be a good wife and mother. What I wanted to do most was to make the White House the most perfect house in America. That mansion is so much more than just the official center of the executive branch and a place to entertain. It should be a showplace of a great heritage. But when Mrs. Eisenhower showed me around it the first time, all I could think was, oh, God, it's the worst place in the world. It was so cold and dreary. It looked like it had been furnished by a discount furniture store. The windows did not open, and when we tried to use the fireplaces, they smoked because they had not been used in so long. Now, Jack had to be convinced of the worthiness of the project. He said his aides came to him and they said, "Oh, no, you can't make any changes to the White House. Just look at the Truman balcony. If you make any changes, it'll be just like that." And I said to him, it won't be like the Truman balcony. You know, people were really upset when Truman added that balcony. So I set up a fine arts committee and we hired a curator. We went through every room of the White House looking for forgotten historical treasures. I felt so strongly the White House should have as fine a collection of American paintings as possible. Do you remember Walter Annenberg, the great newspaper and publisher? He had this portrait of Benjamin Franklin that I knew would be perfect in the White House. So I called him up and I told him all about our plans to make the White House a national monument. Mr. Annenberg, I have heard that you have a magnificent portrait of Ben Franklin. And of course, that's why I thought of you. Mr. Annenberg, you are the first citizen of Philadelphia. Do you think that one great Philadelphia resident would give the White House a portrait of another great Philadelphia resident? And do you know, even though that painting had cost him more than $250,000, he gave it. We relied on donations like that. Oh, and the proceeds from this little booklet that we put together all about the White House, aside from the obvious benefit of having a book and something that I knew children could take home with them, I also knew it would be something we could sell to raise money. You know, it was all private donations, no public money at all. You know, people weren't just going to give up good pieces of furniture. Or you'd have 99 cups of tea with some old lady, and then she'd only give you $50. So I'd been wanting to write a book we could sell. And of course, all of Jack's aides said, oh, no, you can't sell anything in the White House. So I went to Jack and I explained it and he listened. And then he said, all right, go ahead, which was nice of him. And it did turn out to be all right. Oh, and then the television program. You know, that was Jack's idea. He was the one who arranged for CBS to do the taping in the White House. It was right after most of the work was finished. Nervous? Absolutely. I think I only got through that taping with the help of Marlboros and several strong scotches. The program aired on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1962. I have been told that 3 out of 4 of every American who owned a television watched it. I was not one of them, but I am glad for the visibility that it gave to our work. I just thought everything in the White House should be the best, the entertainment given there. And if it was an American company you could help, I like to do that. If not, just so long as it was the best. My husband and I shared a belief that the artist should be honored by society. The arts have always been treated as a poor stepchild in this country. And you know, Jack tried so hard. When we succeeded in bringing the great cellist Pablo Casals to the White House, such a wonderful night. But I had to station my social secretary, Letitia Baldridge, behind a doorway directly in Jack's line of view. That way she could signal to him when the music was really finished. Otherwise, there was always the danger that Jack would leap up at any pause in the music and start shaking the artist's hand. I had hoped so much to one day have a minister for the arts in the cabinet, as they do in France, meeting the French minister of culture. I remember saying to him, Monsieur Mauro, it is such a pleasure to meet you. I have such an affinity for your country. Do you know, both of my grandparents are French. What's that? Yours were too. Monsieur Mauro, I have been thinking so much about something you said. You said that art, that public places with sculpture can affect someone as they're rushing off to work, perhaps change their view of themselves. Isn't that wonderful? Family, though, That's most important. Whatever work I did, I never let it interfere with our family life. Jack and I both wanted a large family. When I found out that I was expecting another baby last year, we were both ecstatic. But when Patrick was born in September, he only lived a few days. And Jack was inconsolable. As shocking as it was for me, I think it was even worse for him. He nearly collapsed over it. And I was so melancholy after Patrick's death. I know I went away on vacation, and perhaps I stayed away longer than I should have. Perhaps I was a bit snappish when I got back. I could have made his life so much happier those last few weeks. I could have tried harder to get over my melancholy. I could have kept him from going to Texas. It was a political fence mending trip, starting the campaign for 1964. All he said to me was, I'd love you to go with me, but only if you want to go. You could be a great help, but if you don't want to go, I will understand. So of course I went with him to Texas, even though I knew I would hate every minute of it. But it seemed like a small sacrifice since Jack wanted me there. And certainly I did have a feeling it was going well. There were such big crowds and such wavy, nice, happy people. Wonderful assemblies with warm welcomes. 3 times we were greeted with the yellow roses of Texas. Only when we got to Dallas, they gave me red roses. I can remember thinking, how funny to be given red roses when you're in Texas. And when we got to Dallas, there was the biggest motorcade from the airport. And when we were all in the car and the motorcade was ready to begin, one of Jack's assistants came running up to me and he said to me, "Now you make sure to look to your left, away from the president. Wave at the people on your side. If you both wave at the same voter, it's just a waste." So in that motorcade, I usually was looking mostly to my left and he was looking mostly to the right, which is one reason we were not looking at each other very often. And it was terribly hot, just blinding all of us. And at one point, Mrs. Connolly, the governor's wife, she was sitting in front of me and she turned around and she said, "Well, Mr. President, you certainly can't say Dallas doesn't love you." And he said, "No, you can't." There's something like that. And she said, "We'll be there soon." Now, in a motorcade, there is always noise, and there are motorcycles beside you, a lot of them backfiring. There was a noise, but it really didn't seem to me like any different sort of noise because there always is noise, motorcycles and things. I was looking to the left when out of the corner of my eye, I saw Governor Connolly suddenly sit up and he said, "Oh, no, no, no." And so I turned to the right. All I remember is my husband. He had this sort of puzzled look on his face and his hands were up. And I remember thinking, he looks just as if he has a slight headache. I just remember that, no blood or anything. And then he raised his hands and fell into my lap. And then I just remember being down in the car and there was so much confusion. I know there were photographs of me climbing out the back. I don't remember that at all. I just remember being down in the car and It seemed like an eternity, that ride to the hospital. And when they got to the hospital, they tried to take me away. They tried to grab me. And I kept saying, I am not going to leave him. I am not going to leave him. I am not going to leave him. I remember this long corridor. A big policeman brought me a chair and I sat and I watched them all going in with saline solutions and other things. And for a minute, I thought, maybe he's not gone. Maybe he's still alive. I saw them going in and I thought, maybe. I knew he was gone. Then I saw a doctor coming towards me and he said to me, Mrs. Kennedy, you need a sedative. And I said to him, I want to be with him when he goes. And this doctor forced his way in. He just kept saying, it's her prerogative, it's her prerogative. So I finally got in. There must have been 40 people in that tiny little operating room. There was already a sheet over Jack. So I took his foot and I kissed it. It was sticking out. And then someone found his hand under the sheet and I held it. All the time the priest was saying, the extreme unction. And all I could think was, if only I had been looking to the right, I would have seen the first shot hit him and I could have pulled him down. I was looking to the left. Well, there is this one last thing that I'd like to share. I'm really rather ashamed of myself. Jack, every time Jack ever quoted anything, it was always Greek or Roman. And yet one thing keeps going through my head, this line from a musical comedy. I can remember saying to Bobby, I've got to talk with somebody. I've got to see somebody. This line from a musical comedy has become almost an obsession with me. At night, before going to bed, we had this Victrola. We'd play a couple of records. I'd get out of bed at night when it was so cold. And there was this song that he loved at the very end. He loved Camelot. It's the last song on the last side of the record. Ask every person if he's heard the story and tell it loud and clear if he has not. How once there was a spot for one brief, shining moment. And it'll never be that way again. Oh, I know there will be other great presidents, and the Johnsons have been wonderful, but there will never be another Camelot. Jack loved history so much. History made Jack what he was. This sick little boy, he sat and read history. He had scarlet fever. He was this little boy in bed, sick so much of the time. And all the time he was sick in bed, he was reading history. He was reading Marlborough and the Knights of the Round Table, and he loved that song. So then I thought, well, maybe if history made Jack that way, made him see heroes, then perhaps others also. Oh, history. I will tell all of you one thing. When this is all finally over, I am going to crawl into the deepest retirement. I'm not going to be one of those people who goes around talking about themselves all the time. I don't want to go out on a Kennedy drive, to go to a Kennedy airport, to visit a Kennedy school. I don't want medals for Jack. I have everything I want. I have that flame at Arlington Cemetery. Do you know that was one of the very first things that Caroline ever learned to recognize? I care about that flame. And Caroline, do you know, all through the funeral services, she held onto my hand like a trooper. She's my helper. John, well, John will make friends with everyone immediately. He surprises me in so many ways. I would like John to grow up to be a good boy. I really have no better wishes for him. I would like John to be a fine young man. And so do you know, I think I have known the answer to my question all along, my earlier question about what to do next. There's really only one thing I can do, isn't there? Save my children. They have to grow up without thinking back at their father's murder all the time. They have to grow up attuned to life in a very important way. Moving to New York with John and Caroline, that will be good for me and stop me from brooding all the time. Oh, I cannot thank all of you enough for stopping here today and sharing today with me. Perhaps all of us, perhaps we can help others, like those crowds outside on the lawn, to understand we are all human. Even though a person may be very well known, they still hold in their hearts the emotions of any other person. For those moments that are the most important we will ever know in life, for marriage and death and birth. And so I do remain Mrs. John F. Kennedy. Thank you all so much for stopping by. Good day. All right, but of course, don't go anywhere, because in the minutes that we have left, I'd like to open it up for questions, if anyone has any questions that have ever come to mind.
Mrs. Kennedy, before we get into questions, I must thank you for doing this for us today. You know, we are all about First Ladies here at the National First Ladies Library. And so what charms me so much about you is that you give so much credit to your husband, as all First Ladies do. And yet you, my dear, are quite special yourself. And so I wanted to ask you what your favorite drink is. Is it scotch? You were talking about Jack's. What was your favorite drink?
Actually, I was really most prone probably to champagne than anything else. Usually whatever Jack was making. It really is very, very true that, you know, it's the generation, right, where you grow up, and it's a role. It's the supporting the husband and what he wants to do. And I tended to get most of my opinions from Jack. All my political views, that all came from Jack, because his were always the best, and I always liked that.
But I know that you were talking about how much Jack loved to read history. Don't you, isn't that something you too?
I do. It is something that we both share. It's one of our great passions. I've always loved reading from time I was really a very young girl. And there's always a book that's with me. I've always encouraged reading to my children, you know, sharing the love of books with children. I think it's one of the greatest gifts that you can ever give to children. And it's really wonderful that Jack loves to read. You know, if you leave a book out for Jack, next thing you know, he'll be up and reading it. And that was something that we really shared a lot in common.
Oh, I think, yeah, I could tell. You guys just seemed like you both were so in tune with history, that type of thing. And I also wanted to ask you, you were talking about the small diplomacy of bringing Mrs. Khrushchev to the window. I thought that was so delightful. But you did so much in the way of diplomacy. And you were talking about your fashion, that type of, I know you don't like to talk about it, but
Yeah.
you did use that, didn't you?
Well,
I
it
mean,
is. It's always been, I think, a sort of a way of supporting what your husband does. And I don't think I realized it until we really were in the White House. And I realized, well, I really ought to wear mostly American designers, or like Cassini designed my official wardrobe, and he was just wonderful. And worked together to see what we could do. Usually it seemed like little things. When we visited Canada, that's actually where I got this particular suit, because I could wear red to honor the Canadian Mounties. And I loved when we went to France, because you could wear French designers as a nod to the wonderful French fashion. When we had dinner at Versailles, I was able to do that. And it was really wonderful when we visited anywhere where I spoke the language, because I could talk with someone without having to have an interpreter if we were in France or a country where Spanish was spoken. I don't know if any of these things were really large, but there is something, I think, that in a very important way, you realize the setting in which the presidency appears, and what the president wears, and what the first lady wears, and what the White House looked like. I remember we were visiting South America, and I could see they had these wonderful, the presidential homes where they had all the great arts and great furniture. And I wanted to do something like that so I could help create a sort of a stage on which the Kennedy presidency could be presented. And it didn't seem like anything different from perhaps what I might ordinarily do. I've always loved decorating and those kind of things, but perhaps it is more important than just a supporting role.
yeah. Oh, I think so. And you did it so beautifully, just so beautifully.
Thank
Patty,
you.
did you want to say anything?
Yes, we had actually a question for you, Ms. Jacqueline Kennedy, that we had. The question is, please describe your relationship with your mother, Janet, and your sister, Lee.
Oh, absolutely. I think, like a lot of families, it's very complex. My mother, I think, had a very difficult time because, she separated from my father when we were still young, and Lee is 4 years younger than me, so even more so. She was very, very young when they separated. And of course, our father, every time he took us out, he would just, give us all sorts of gifts and take us to the zoo. And then we'd come home, and my mother had to be very much the disciplinarian, she always felt. And I think in some ways that was really hard. But I'm so grateful that what she really instilled in both me and in Lee was in the importance of relationships that you have with people. And it's little things. It's writing a thank you note as soon as you get home from a party. And it's the way that you dress yourself to present yourself to the world. These were all very, very important to my mother. And I don't think she always gets the real credit for it. It was my mother who was the one when I first moved into the White House, and I said, oh, it looks just dreadful. I don't know if I can even live here. And she's the one who said that perhaps the project that you could take on is to make the White House the type of setting that you would like it to be. And that whole project, the restoration, was really very much influenced by her. So even though I know she was very strict, and we tend to see her as more of a disciplinarian, she's been enormously influential. And Lee has always been able to step in. When I visited India and Pakistan, it was with Lee. Sometimes when I would be traveling abroad, she would be there. Once in a while, she could even purchase French clothes and send them to me. But I know it's been difficult for her because typically it's been me that the newspapers want to cover. And it's hard when you're someone who is as lively and stylish as Lee. So it can be strange at times, but we're a family. We're always very close.
That's wonderful. So I have one more question that came to us from some of our viewers. One was, how did you come to deal with the affairs that Jack Kennedy had?
Oh, it's something that we don't really always like to talk about. I knew who Jack was when we married. One of Jack's good friends took me out for lunch shortly before our wedding. And I come from the generation where that was perhaps more common than we might think of today. And of course, my father was quite the ladies' man. I think my view at the time was, as long as it's done discreetly and it doesn't create public humiliation, it's something I'd be willing to tolerate privately. Don't necessarily think that that's exactly how people in the future are going to feel about it, but that's the way that we felt about it back then.
Yes.
In fact,
yes.
You know what? This is a really good moment to transition, if you don't mind. I want to take just a minute right at the end, and I know we're at the top of the hour, but I want to very quickly take off my identity as Jackie. And if you don't mind, I don't know how my hair is going to look, but I'm going to take off my hair. Jackie actually did occasionally wear a wig, so that's my justification for that. But I'll do that so that you know I'm Leslie Goddard. Very briefly, I don't think Jackie would have spoken about it, but I think her view of it did change over time, because later on you hear reports of someone coming to her and saying, you know, my husband's having an affair, and she said, "You get a lawyer right now." There's every indication that Jackie knew what was going on. She undoubtedly did not know the full extent of it, but we know she was aware of it, and she does seem to have been willing to tolerate it. I always think one of the really most fascinating what ifs is, would JFK have been able to keep that side of him private from the public and the press, because he was becoming much more reckless by the end of the first term. But of course, we'll never know. One other thing I wanted to point out, if anyone is interested, my backdrop is actually of the living room at the house that Jackie moved into after the assassination. And it's a beautiful classical colonial home in Georgetown. But I'm always so struck when I think about Jackie moving out of the White House, because it always reminds me, at the moment of the assassination, and this is as true for Jackie as it is for Mary Lincoln and Lucretia Garfield and Ida McKinley, at that moment, the First Lady lost. It wasn't just a losing of your husband, it's a losing of your job and a losing of your home. And the depth of that in an assassination, and especially one like Jackie and Mrs. Lincoln experience, it's happened so quickly. It's understandable why Jackie suffered, as we now recognize, from PTSD the rest of her life.
Oh,
So,
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Leslie, this has just been wonderful. You've done a phenomenal job helping us get to know Jackie better. We are so grateful to you. And I want to remind our viewers that this has been recorded, so it will be up on our YouTube channel, and it was on Facebook Live. So if you would like to see it again, you can see it on those channels. And again, thank you so much, Leslie, for coming and sharing your talents with us. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming too. And thank you to the First Ladies Library for having me. It's a pleasure.
We'll have you back soon. Thank you, Leslie. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.